Architectures of spiritual consciousness, the ascetic-purificatory mode, the central intuition. For the ascetic purificatory mind, spiritual life begins with a simple and severe recognition. Not everything that arises within us deserves obedience. Hunger appears and asks for satisfaction. Boredom asks for stimulation. Anger asks for discharge. Fear asks for retreat. Possession asks to be protected. Status asks to be defended. The senses continually reach toward what attracts, soothes, excites, confirms, distracts, or relieves them. And because these movements are intimate, because they arise inside the body and mind, they can easily be mistaken for commands. The ascetic purificatory mode introduces a separation that ordinary life often fails to make. A desire can be real without being sovereign. A discomfort can be genuine without constituting an emergency. A preference can matter without determining what must happen. Its question is therefore not initially whether desire is sinful or pleasure corrupting. It is more fundamental. Must consciousness obey something simply because it has appeared? Its answer is no. This is the beginning of tapas, restraint, fasting, brahmacarya, silence, solitude, simplicity, voluntary poverty, guarded attention, regulated rhythms, obedience, vigils, and the countless disciplines through which spiritual cultures have attempted to make a human being less governed by impulse. The external forms differ enormously. One person enters a monastery and reorganizes almost every dimension of life around discipline. Another becomes a sadhu and owns almost nothing. Another remains a householder but protects certain hours from distraction, keeps regular periods of fasting or silence, refuses unnecessary stimulation, or deliberately limits consumption. The severity is not what defines the mode. What matters is the operation being performed. The ascetic purificatory mode deliberately works upon the conditions under which consciousness ordinarily becomes scattered, dependent, reactive, and possessed. Food reveals appetite, possession reveals attachment and fear of loss. Silence reveals how often speech functions not to communicate but to discharge tension or defend identity. Solitude reveals dependence upon stimulation, recognition, or company. Discomfort reveals the speed with which unpleasant sensation becomes interpreted as something that must immediately be removed. Even attention itself becomes a field of discipline because what repeatedly receives attention gradually acquires psychological force. The basic gesture is small. Something arises and says, "I need this." The discipline answers, "Let us see." A space opens between impulse and action. At first, that space may be tiny. The person wants to answer an insult and waits, wants to check the phone and does not immediately move, wants to abandon a difficult practice because the mood has changed and remains a little longer, wants to purchase something and allows the desire to survive without immediate completion. The purpose is not necessarily permanent refusal. It is to discover whether the inner command possesses the inevitability it claimed. This is why the archetypal ascetic body has carried such symbolic force across civilizations. The monk, sadhu, hermit, sannyasin, forest renunciate, celibate yogi, fasting saint, or desert contemplative embodies a statement that ordinary consumer consciousness often finds difficult to believe. A human being may require less than the world teaches them to require. The image is easily romanticized, its shadows are enormous, yet the intuition beneath it remains powerful. Much of what passes for freedom may consist merely in having efficient access to satisfaction. We can eat quickly, purchase instantly, escape discomfort, obtain stimulation without interruption, seek recognition continuously, and fill almost every empty interval. This feels free because few external barriers remain. The ascetic asks another question. If a person cannot refrain, how free is the apparent choice? Ordinary consciousness gives away sovereignty in thousands of small transactions. A slight discomfort appears and relief is sought before the discomfort has even been understood. A notification arrives and attention turns automatically. Criticism appears and identity begins defending itself. Boredom enters and must immediately be displaced. None of these responses is necessarily morally wrong. The problem is subtler. They begin to acquire sovereignty. Ascetic practice seeks to weaken that sovereignty. Its deepest operation is therefore not deprivation for its own sake, but deconditioning through deliberate non-obedience. The person discovers that an impulse can arise without becoming action. That urgency can be tolerated long enough for its structure to become visible, and that a preferred condition can fail without the whole inner world collapsing around its absence. But mature ascetic purificatory practice does not aim to preserve a permanent civil war in which one part of the personality heroically crushes another. If spiritual life remains an endless sequence of victories over the body, desire remains central even when it continually loses. The deeper movement is toward reordering desire itself. What once demanded constant resistance begins to demand less. The person does not merely become more powerful at refusing, they gradually need less refusal. This changes the meaning of renunciation. From outside, the observer sees what has been abandoned. From inside, the practitioner may increasingly notice what no longer needs to be carried. Possession appears as sacrifice only while possession seems essential. Silence appears empty only while continuous stimulation is required. Simplicity appears poor only while abundance remains the measure of sufficiency. At mature depth, the movement becomes quieter. The smaller falls away because something greater has become more real. That greater need not be identical across traditions. It may be God, liberation, truth, contemplation, love, ethical responsibility, clarity, service, awakening, or the realization of the self. This vertical revaluation is essential because self-denial alone does not make the operation spiritual. An athlete can deny comfort, an ambitious executive can work without rest, a soldier can endure extraordinary hardship, a person obsessed with achievement may discipline food, sleep, sexuality, and leisure with tremendous force, while becoming more acquisitive and more psychologically driven than before. The decisive question is always, what is the discipline serving? Asceticism is not merely strengthened executive control. It attempts to reduce the sovereignty of lesser compulsions so that consciousness becomes more available to what it recognizes as deeper, truer, or more worthy of allegiance. This is why suppression and purification must be distinguished sharply. Suppression says this movement must not exist. Push it away. Purification asks instead, what is this movement? What power does it possess? What continually feeds it? And what happens when automatic reinforcement stops? A person can abstain outwardly while remaining inwardly dominated. They can fast while food occupies the whole mind, own nothing while constructing a grand identity around possessionlessness, remain silent while conducting endless imaginary arguments, or submit outwardly while inward resentment becomes the hidden center of the relationship. The behavior has changed. Consciousness may not have become freer. The real measure is therefore not simply what disappears from action, it is what ceases to consume consciousness. This is also why mature asceticism does not need what it renounces to become evil. If wealth must continually be condemned in order for poverty to feel meaningful, wealth still possesses psychological force. If ordinary family life must be treated as spiritually inferior for monastic renunciation to retain dignity, the renunciate remains dependent upon what has supposedly been surpassed. If pleasure must remain morally contaminated in order for restraint to survive, aversion may be doing the work that craving once performed. Purification does not mean proving that creation was a mistake. The deeper fruit is sufficiency. The practitioner does not merely learn, I can survive with less. Something subtler may emerge. Less is enough. This changes the relation between consciousness and the world. Ordinary life is filled with hidden contracts. I can remain peaceful if the environment is quiet, if my body feels good, if I receive recognition, if my plans succeed, if stimulation remains available, if nobody interrupts me, if enough comfort surrounds me. Ascetic practice exposes these contracts one by one and asks how many are genuinely necessary. Human beings remain embodied and vulnerable. Food, sleep, safety, relationship, medical care, and material conditions matter. Mature asceticism is not a fantasy of biological independence. It is a reduction in unnecessary psychological requirements, the number of conditions that must be fulfilled before the person can remain relatively coherent begins to shrink. A useful formula for this mature fruit is asceticism lowers the price consciousness demands from life in order to remain at peace. The person therefore becomes lighter, not because nothing matters, but because less must be constantly maintained. Less image needs protection, less stimulation must be supplied, less possession must be defended, less novelty is required before attention can remain awake, less resentment appears when preference is denied. This is also why ascetic purificatory consciousness can function as a secondary structural capacity within almost every other spiritual mode. Devotion needs enough discipline to remain when emotional sweetness disappears. Ritual needs bodily continuity. Analysis needs patience before difficult problems. Architecture needs years of sustained labor rather than continual pursuit of novelty. Compassion needs the capacity to accept inconvenience. Contemplation requires attention that does not immediately flee silence. Even transgression requires containment if boundary crossing is to mean anything more than appetite. Asceticism can therefore operate like a spine. The spine is not the whole organism. It does not determine what is loved, what is contemplated, what is believed, or what revelation means. But without enough structural integrity, these higher operations may repeatedly collapse before fatigue, impulse, boredom, fear, self-will, and distraction. This ancient insight has acquired a peculiarly contemporary clarity. Earlier ascetic traditions warned about guarding the senses. Modern people can observe the same problem in a device carried in the pocket. A notification appears, attention moves, one fragment leads to another, novelty has no natural ending, and an hour can disappear without any single dramatic act of indulgence. Nothing obviously sinful has occurred. Consciousness has simply been captured repeatedly. In an economy increasingly built around the capture of attention, the capacity to withhold attention becomes an ascetic power. The modern monastery may sometimes be no more dramatic than a protected hour, a phone kept outside the room, a walk without continuous sound, or the ability to read one difficult argument after novelty has disappeared. The outer form changes, the inner question remains ancient. Who governs the gate? The mature ascetic purificatory mind therefore begins with a disciplined no, but its destiny is not endless refusal. The refusals are medicine. Their purpose is to weaken what has become disproportionately powerful until a simpler yes becomes possible. Yes to what is enough, yes to what is actually needed, yes to what matters more, yes to what can be received without possession. The goal is not deprivation. The goal is to become free enough that less of consciousness must be spent maintaining what was never essential. Berlioz. What the ascetic purificatory mode is not. The ascetic purificatory mode is easy to confuse with other spiritual architectures because fasting, celibacy, silence, regularity, simplicity, obedience, and restraint appear throughout religious life. Outward behavior does not identify the mode. The same fast may be ritual, moral, devotional, medical, ascetic, or preparatory to another practice, depending upon the operation it performs within consciousness. The defining question is not what the practitioner is doing, but what the practice is trying to change. Not ritual sacramental consciousness. The ritual sacramental and ascetic purificatory modes often look almost identical from outside because both create continuity beyond mood. The ritualist performs the rite even when enthusiasm disappears. The ascetic continues the discipline even when appetite protests, yet the centers differ. The ritual sacramental mode says the sacred form must be enacted. The ascetic purificatory mode says the practitioner must be changed. A ritual fast may matter because it enters sacred time, honors a transmitted order, creates correspondence, or participates in a form whose meaning cannot be separated from its enactment. An ascetic fast asks what hunger reveals about dependence and whether appetite has acquired disproportionate authority. The ritualist may wake before dawn because the office belongs before dawn. The ascetic may wake before dawn because comfort, sleep, inertia, or self-will are being trained. The practices can overlap perfectly, and mature ritual frequently purifies the practitioner, but their governing questions remain different. Ritual asks, what must be done? Asceticism asks, what in me must cease ruling? Not the subtractive axial mode. The resemblance to subtractive axial consciousness is deeper because both can produce silence, simplicity, celibacy, few possessions, withdrawal, and apparent indifference to comfort. Yet their movements are fundamentally different. The ascetic works upon conditioning. Desire appears, and the question becomes whether it must be followed, how it is fed, and what happens when satisfaction is interrupted. The subtractive practitioner turns toward the claimant. To whom has this desire appeared? The ascetic purifies the field. The subtractive mode asks, to whom does the field appear? One operation changes the conditioned person, the other eventually places even the identity of the person under inquiry. This is why the modes can correct one another so powerfully. Asceticism exposes premature, non-dual rhetoric by testing whether the organism actually remains governed by status, comfort, praise, fear, or appetite. Subtraction exposes ascetic pride by asking who exactly has become pure. The ascetic can therefore say to premature non-duality, do not confuse an accurate doctrine with embodied freedom. The subtractive mode can answer, do not spend 30 years perfecting an identity whose reality you have never examined. Both corrections matter. Not the transgressive transformative mode. Asceticism and transgression seem like opposites. One establishes boundaries, the other may deliberately cross them. One refuses stimulation, the other may enter forbidden intensity, yet both are concerned with freedom from conditioning. Their tests differ. The ascetic asks whether the person can refuse. The transgressor asks whether the person can enter without becoming enslaved. This gives asceticism a devastating diagnostic for counterfeit transgression. Could you abstain? Someone unable to refuse gratification proves little by declaring gratification sacred. A person already governed by intensity has not transcended convention merely by seeking more intensity. Mature transgressive traditions therefore frequently presuppose capacities that are ascetic in structure: containment, qualification, preparation, secrecy, discipline, and the ability to maintain a boundary before testing whether freedom survives its crossing. The opposite correction matters equally. An ascetic may become highly capable of refusal while remaining terrified of what is refused. Then transgression asks, are you free of the object or merely protected from it? The polarity can be stated simply. Asceticism asks whether you can remain free by not crossing. Transgression asks whether you can remain free after crossing. Without asceticism, transgression can become appetite. Without the possibility of integration, asceticism can become fear. When I prefer not moralism, hatred of pleasure, or the cultivation of suffering. Ascetic practices often overlap with moral prohibitions, but moralism asks primarily whether something is right or wrong. Asceticism asks a different question. What does this do to consciousness? An activity can be ethically permissible while still proving destabilizing in a particular phase of practice. A person may decide that unrestricted media, certain forms of entertainment, particular social environments, or some pleasures scatter attention excessively. The claim need not be that these things are intrinsically evil. It can simply be, I am not free around this yet. Conversely, ascetic difficulty does not possess intrinsic moral value. Fasting does not make someone compassionate. Celibacy does not make someone honest. Poverty does not make someone wise. Silence does not make someone kind. The same distinction applies to pleasure. Ascetic practice often limits pleasure because pleasure can become habit, expectation, or attachment. Yet its mature target is dependence upon pleasure rather than pleasure itself. A person can enjoy something without requiring its continuation. Craving and aversion can be opposite forms of the same captivity. The ascetic who hates pleasure may remain as psychologically organized around pleasure as the person who continually seeks it. The sign has reversed. The object remains central. Suffering is equally incapable of validating itself. Asceticism may deliberately include hunger, physical exertion, simplicity, vigils, solitude, cold, or other discomforts. Yet difficulty does not prove transformation. A damaged body is not automatically a purified body. Hardship may strengthen pride, obsession, or identity just as easily as freedom. Austerity must justify itself by the freedom it produces, not by the suffering it demonstrates. The body is one of the fields through which purification occurs. Turning the field into an enemy is a profound reversal. Not productivity culture or permanent dependence on authority. Modern culture has rediscovered many ascetic techniques: strict routines, cold exposure, intense training, reduced entertainment, habit tracking, delayed gratification, dietary discipline, but often in service of very different aims. The person becomes harder, more efficient, more productive, more competitive, better able to tolerate overwork, and more intensely oriented towards status or acquisition. The techniques may be ascetic, the consciousness may remain acquisitive. What is discipline serving? If restraint simply makes ambition more efficient, Rajas has learned to train itself. Obedience contains a related ambiguity. It can be a genuine ascetic discipline because self-will often confuses preference with truth. A monastery, teacher, or rule may temporarily provide an external structure stronger than the practitioner's undeveloped discernment. This can expose the demand that reality continually accommodate personal preference. But obedience is a discipline, not the final spiritual condition. External obedience should mature into internal discernment. A teacher may guide, correct, and impose useful forms without acquiring permanent ownership of conscience. The mature disciple can receive authority without abandoning responsibility, and the mature teacher does not require the disciple to remain psychologically dependent forever. The opposite is outsourced sovereignty. The person knows what the teacher would say about everything, but no longer knows how to encounter reality without the teacher's interpretation. The ascetic purificatory mode seeks neither a human being governed by appetite nor one permanently governed by another person's will. Its distinctive movement remains simpler. Something has power over consciousness. The practitioner deliberately changes the relationship to that power until obedience is no longer automatic. And then comes the second question: what becomes possible when its rule begins to weaken? The mode does not seek a human being who has successfully eliminated life. It seeks a human being capable of entering life with fewer masters. The world from within. From inside ascetic purificatory consciousness, ordinary life begins to look densely populated by demands. The body wants, the senses reach, the mind reacts, and the environment continually supplies opportunities for stimulation, possession, recognition, relief, comparison, and distraction. Each movement may appear trivial in isolation, yet together they form a web of dependence. Much of what feels like freedom is simply the ability to satisfy impulses efficiently. The person can eat when wanting, buy when desiring, scroll when bored, answer when irritated, escape when uncomfortable, distract themselves when anxious, and replace silence before silence has time to reveal anything. Few external obstacles exist, so the life feels free. Ascetic consciousness looks at the same situation and notices that the person may have lost the ability to refrain. This changes the phenomenology of ordinary things. Pleasure is no longer only pleasure, it also reveals dependence. Discomfort becomes information. Silence exposes the need for stimulation. Possession reveals the labor of protection, comparison, maintenance, and fear of loss. Recognition exposes how much identity relies upon reflection from others. The mode gradually becomes interested in the hidden price of things. It asks not simply whether something is enjoyable, but what psychological infrastructure its enjoyment creates. How much attention will be required afterward? How much fear of loss? How rapidly will pleasure become expectation? How much of the organism will be organized around obtaining it again? This produces a sensitivity to excess that is not reducible to quantity. Excess occurs when something occupies more consciousness than its actual value warrants. Food may occupy more thought than nutrition requires. Money may consume more attention than material security requires. Recognition may require more emotional energy than its social function warrants. Information may grow far beyond what can become understanding. Entertainment may fill every empty interval until silence itself feels threatening. The ratio has become wrong. Ascetic simplification attempts to restore proportion. Fewer possessions, reduced stimulation, regular rhythm, periods of silence, deliberate limits, a stable practice. These may look impoverished from outside while feeling spacious from within. Every unnecessary demand removed from life returns some attention. Every appetite that weakens releases energy. The world becomes quieter not because the world has vanished, but because fewer things are issuing commands. Asceticism as experiment. Asceticism has an empirical quality that is easy to overlook. It does not merely assert that attachment exists, it tests attachment. The person says, I am not dependent on this. The practice replies, remove it for a while, then see. A stimulus is withdrawn, gratification delayed, praise unavailable, silence introduced, possession reduced, a familiar comfort interrupted. Suddenly, what appeared psychologically insignificant can fill the whole mind. Arguments arise with remarkable speed. This is pointless. I deserve relief. I can stop tomorrow. The discipline is unhealthy. Perhaps some objections are true. Asceticism does not make every refusal wise. But the intensity of the negotiation itself reveals something. Dependence often becomes visible only when satisfaction is interrupted. A person may sincerely believe they are detached from recognition, while admiration remains plentiful, beyond anger while nobody challenges them, or independent of comfort while life remains comfortable. Ascetic practice removes a supporting condition long enough to observe what appears. In this sense, austerity becomes a laboratory. What actually owns me? The answer is not always what the person believed. This experimental quality explains both the power and danger of severity. If one fast reveals hidden dependency, perhaps a longer one will reveal more. If one period of solitude exposes attachment to company, perhaps a year will expose deeper layers. If owning less creates freedom, perhaps owning nothing will reveal something still deeper. The question contains genuine courage. How much of what I call necessary is actually necessary? Most people encounter the collapse of conditions involuntarily. Illness removes comfort, poverty removes options, war removes security. age removes capacities. Death eventually removes almost everything. Asceticism voluntarily rehearses smaller losses while choice remains, not necessarily because suffering is good, but because the organism learns that the failure of a preference is survivable. The confidence produced is not, nothing can hurt me. It is more modest. More can be endured than my fear initially claimed. Ertate. Guarding the gates. Mature ascetic purificatory consciousness does not rely exclusively upon heroic resistance after desire has already intensified. It notices that what repeatedly enters consciousness helps determine what later appears as desire. Conditioning is cumulative. The eye, ear, company, speech, media, rhythm, and environment therefore become relevant before the decisive impulse arises. Someone who spends hours consuming outrage will inhabit a different mental field from someone who does not. Someone continually exposed to comparison, erotic stimulation, novelty, or status signaling is not beginning each moment from psychological neutrality. Asceticism consequently asks not only, can I resist, but why am I continually feeding what I later struggle to resist? This is the logic of monastery, hermitage, retreat, regulated schedule, silence, limited possessions, and guarded sensory life. They reduce the number of battles. A mature practitioner does not need the vanity of standing before maximum temptation merely to demonstrate strength. One way to become less governed by an impulse is to stop constructing a world that continually feeds it. The principle is particularly visible in contemporary technological life. Modern platforms are built to compete for attention, often by learning what reliably attracts, frightens, provokes, reassures, or excites. The feed has no natural ending. Attention may be captured dozens of times without the person making one clear decision to surrender it. The ancient instruction to guard the senses therefore becomes unexpectedly current. Turn the device off sometimes, remove unnecessary notifications, keep an interval in which interruption is not permitted, walk without supplying continuous audio, read long enough for the first boredom to pass, remain with one task after novelty disappears. This is not nostalgia. In an economy built around the capture of attention, withholding attention becomes a form of renunciation. Delay in the experience of time. Compulsive consciousness experiences desire as urgency. Hunger wants food now. Curiosity wants the answer now. Anxiety wants certainty now. Anger wants expression now. Boredom wants stimulation now. The ascetic introduces a small word, not yet, not never, not necessarily as punishment, not yet. The interval reveals that desire has a life cycle. It arises, intensifies, bargains, changes, and often weakens. The mind discovers that much of the apparent emergency belonged to the desire rather than the situation. Urgency is frequently a property of desire rather than reality. This is one reason ascetic training can make a person harder to manipulate. So much contemporary persuasion depends upon urgency. Buy now, respond now, fear now, be outraged now, choose now. The disciplined person has acquired another possibility. Wait. This capacity serves every spiritual mode because depth almost always requires remaining after immediate reward has disappeared. The fear beneath comfort. The ascetic also discovers that attachment to comfort frequently conceals attachment to predictability. Familiar food, temperature, schedules, people, private space, reliable stimulation, and material security regulate the organism. When these conditions change, what emerges may be more than preference. Fear appears. What if I cannot sleep? What if I am hungry? What if I cannot leave? What if I have nothing to distract me? What if the environment remains unpleasant? Voluntary austerity allows these fears to be approached incrementally. The person discovers that discomfort occurred, relief was desired, and yet the whole structure did not collapse. This does not make suffering good. It makes the organism somewhat less surprised that suffering exists. The mature fruit is not invulnerability, but a wider range of circumstances within which orientation can survive. Increasing space. As purification matures, the world from within begins changing again. At first, reality appears full of temptations. Then it appears full of disciplines. Ideally, both eventually lose some intensity. Food becomes food. Money becomes useful material. Comfort becomes pleasant rather than necessary. Discomfort remains unpleasant without becoming spiritual catastrophe. Attraction can appear without automatically becoming either command or contamination. Silence becomes silence rather than proof of purity. The beginner sees temptation everywhere because struggle is active. The Puritan sees impurity everywhere because struggle has become identity. The mature ascetic may begin seeing ordinary things again. They can refuse without pride and enjoy without grasping. They need less interest in how other people live because another person's comfort, possessions, relationships, or pleasures no longer threaten the legitimacy of their own renunciation. This is one of the clearest signs that purification has moved beyond identity. The object no longer needs to disappear from the world because its sovereignty has weakened within the practitioner. This does not mean every successful discipline ends in re exposure. A lifelong celibate need not break the vow to demonstrate freedom. A recovering addict need not encounter the addictive substance deliberately. A monk need not acquire wealth. Freedom does not require unnecessary testing. The question is psychological rather than theatrical. Does the absent object remain charged with fascination, fear, disgust, superiority, shame, or metaphysical threat? Does the protected environment serve freedom, or does it conceal from the practitioner how fragile freedom remains? The characteristic questions of the mode therefore become increasingly precise. What actually owns me? How much of what I call need is habit? What am I continually feeding and then struggling against? What conditions does my peace secretly require? Is this discipline making the object less psychologically central or more? And finally, can I require less from life without requiring life itself to become smaller? At its best, the ascetic purificatory mode transforms the world from a field of commands into a field of possibilities. Something can be wanted without becoming necessary. Something can hurt without becoming intolerable. Something can be pleasurable without requiring repetition. Something can be refused without becoming evil. Something can be lost without taking the whole identity with it. Its dignity lies here. Freedom often begins not by acquiring another possibility, but by discovering that one possibility was never compulsory. The central operation and mature fruit. The central operation of the ascetic purificatory mode is to reduce the power of compulsion by deliberately changing both behavior and the conditions under which consciousness lives. Its disciplines vary greatly, but their mature development follows a recognizable movement. Restraint, delay, deconditioning, revaluation, sufficiency, steadiness, non-need, availability. The sequence is not mechanically linear, nor will every practitioner pass through it in the same way, but it reveals the direction of maturation, from active resistance against compulsion toward a life in which fewer compulsions require active resistance at all. Restraint and delay. The first movement is restraint. Something arises, and instead of immediately satisfying or expressing it, the person creates an interval. The purpose is initially diagnostic. An impulse that has never been resisted easily masquerades as necessity. Do not answer immediately, do not switch immediately, do not purchase immediately, do not abandon the practice merely because mood changed. Remain long enough to discover what the urge actually does. This develops one of the foundational capacities of the mode. Delay. Many compulsions depend less upon absolute need than upon inability to tolerate unresolved tension. The person needs the tension to stop now. Ascetic discipline teaches that the tension can remain. This is the beginning of non-reactivity, but restraint is only the entrance. A person can maintain perfect outward discipline while being inwardly preoccupied. The true measure is not merely whether behavior has been controlled. The real question is how much psychological territory the object continues to occupy. A discipline succeeds when the compulsion gradually becomes less central. It fails or remains incomplete when the object expands inwardly precisely because it has been removed outwardly. Deconditioning. Once the interval exists, the person can begin seeing how desire is built. The impulse rarely stands alone. Memory, fantasy, environmental cues, repetition, fear, status, and expectation continually reinforce it. The practice therefore moves from isolated resistance toward alteration of the conditions that repeatedly produce the struggle. If endless stimulation destroys attention, reduce stimulation. If a particular environment continually activates comparison, change the environment where possible. If irregular sleep makes practice almost impossible, stabilize the rhythm. If constant availability to communication fragments consciousness, establish boundaries. This is not an attempt to construct a perfectly sterile world. It is recognition that willpower is finite and that conditioning has structure. Why feed continuously what you then spend your spiritual energy fighting? This is where asceticism differs from a heroic cult of temptation. Mature discipline does not require maximal exposure, it creates enough space for another relation to become possible. Revaluation. A deeper transition occurs when renunciation ceases to be experienced primarily as refusal. A greater value becomes more compelling, and the smaller object loses some of its claim. The practitioner does not merely say, no. The deeper movement becomes, this matters more. This protects asceticism from becoming spirituality organized around negation. Love of God may make certain pleasures feel small. Contemplation may become more attractive than continual stimulation. Freedom may become more important than acquisition. Service may become more meaningful than convenience. Truth may become more important than the comfort of preserving self image. The psychological structure of mature renunciation therefore differs from heroic self conquest. If the renounced object remains the great forbidden treasure against which the entire life is organized, it still occupies the center. The small falls away because the larger becomes real. This revaluation is one reason visible austerity can become increasingly misleading as a measure of maturity. The person who seems to possess extraordinary self-control may simply value the object differently. What appears from outside as sacrifice may no longer be experienced internally as a continuous deprivation. Sufficiency. Endurance is an important early fruit. The person learns that hunger, boredom, discomfort, solitude, frustration, and lack of recognition can be tolerated. But endurance is still organized around something missing. Mature ascetic purificatory consciousness may discover a quieter condition. Sufficiency. Not, I can endure having less, but less is enough. The external world now needs to perform less labor before the person can remain relatively steady. A simple meal may be sufficient, a modest space sufficient, a quiet routine sufficient. Fewer possessions may be enough because possession itself occupies less consciousness. This is not absolute self-sufficiency. Bodies need food, sleep, warmth, medical care, relationship, protection, and social support. Ascetic fantasy becomes dangerous when it forgets these realities. What decreases is the number of unnecessary psychological requirements surrounding legitimate need. Asceticism lowers the price consciousness demands from life in order to remain at peace. This is one of the mode's most mature fruits because it produces lightness without requiring denial of embodiment. Steadiness across conditions. As sufficiency grows, fewer external conditions possess absolute veto power over inner coherence. Pleasant conditions remain pleasant. Unpleasant conditions remain unpleasant. The mature ascetic does not become anesthetized. Loss still hurts. Illness may overwhelm. Grief can break the heart. The body remains vulnerable. The fruit is subtler. More can happen without destroying everything that matters. A person who has voluntarily experienced small forms of non-fulfillment may become less psychologically astonished when involuntary life refuses preference. An appetite can remain unsatisfied. Comfort can disappear. Praise can fail to arrive. Plans can change. The person discovers, I do not disappear merely because one supporting condition disappears. This grounded steadiness is one of the reasons ascetic disciplines have historically been associated with fearlessness. It is not the fantasy that nothing can happen. It is familiarity with the fact that preference can fail without identity necessarily collapsing. Purity and sattva. In Indian spiritual language, the ascetic purificatory operation often appears through deliberate cultivation of sattva. Clarity, balance, wakefulness, moderation, discrimination, and relative freedom from the heaviness of tamas and agitation of rajas. Food, sleep, company, media, speech, work, daily rhythm, and environment are evaluated according to the states they repeatedly cultivate. The question is not simply, is this permitted? It is, what kind of consciousness does this repeatedly produce? This perspective makes seemingly mundane choices spiritually relevant. Repeated conditions shape the field in which contemplation, devotion, analysis, ritual, or service must operate. Yet sattva itself can become a dependency. The person may protect clarity so anxiously that noise, children, strong emotion, ordinary work, or unplanned life begin to feel contaminating. Then the practitioner has become dependent upon the very conditions created to weaken dependence. Purity, too, must eventually cease being something possessed. Clarity serves freedom. Freedom does not exist merely to protect clarity. Attention. One of the great practical fruits of the mode is the capacity to remain with one thing after novelty has disappeared. A difficult paragraph becomes uncomfortable. The mind wants another tab. Work becomes repetitive. A message appears. Silence becomes uninteresting. Stimulation is introduced. Ascetic attention learns not to obey every invitation. Remain, continue, read again. Allow boredom to pass through its first layer. This capacity may appear modest, yet almost every serious spiritual operation depends upon it. Devotion that survives only emotional sweetness remains fragile. Inquiry abandoned whenever discomfort appears remains conceptual. Ritual interrupted whenever mood changes loses continuity. Architecture cannot mature if novelty repeatedly steals the years required for construction. The ascetic learns to stop feeding everything that asks to be noticed. This is one reason its secondary spine function matters so much. The purification of self-will. Obedience belongs here as one particular application rather than as the center of the mode. Appetite says the body must receive what it wants. Self-will says reality itself should proceed according to preference. A disciplined setting may expose this by requiring an unpleasant task, anonymous work, acceptance of another rhythm, or silence when self-defense would be preferred. The practitioner learns, I prefer this does not mean this must happen. This can develop humility and flexibility because personal preference loses some of its automatic identification with truth. But the mature fruit is not permanent submission. External regulation should gradually become understanding, internalization, discernment, and responsible sovereignty. The purpose is not to extinguish sovereignty, it is to purify sovereignty of compulsive self-will. The mature person becomes capable of acting without continually centering preference while remaining responsible for judgment. A teacher can help train this capacity. No teacher can permanently substitute for it without reversing the developmental movement. Renunciation by non-need. At the highest end of the mode, asceticism can almost disappear as drama. The person may live simply because simple life is sufficient, own little because possession makes little psychological demand, or tolerate discomfort because comfort is no longer required for inner coherence. From outside, the life can appear severely renounced. Inside, comparatively little may feel sacrificed. Extremity is visible. Non-need is quiet. This is why the most mature ascetic fruit may sometimes appear in someone for whom ascetic purificatory practice was never the governing path. A contemplative realization, devotion, or another transformation may reorganize value so deeply that the external life becomes naturally simple. The important distinction is between method and fruit. The struggling ascetic says, I must not possess. Mature non-need may contain very little movement to possess. The struggling renunciate says, I have sacrificed comfort. Mature non-need may no longer experience simplicity as sacrifice. The struggle that made asceticism visible has begun disappearing. Availability. This brings the mode to a question it must eventually ask if it is not to become self-absorbed. What is all this freedom for? If less attention is consumed by appetite, where does the released attention go? If fewer possessions require maintenance, what becomes possible with the released time? If status matters less, what becomes possible when action does not continually require applause? If stimulation decreases, what becomes audible? The deepest fruit is availability. More of the person becomes available for contemplation, love, service, thought, craft, relationship, God, truth, or whatever other orientation gives the life its meaning. The ascetic does not merely reduce life, they reduce what prevents life from being given fully. This is why the mode can serve nearly every other spiritual architecture while remaining distinct from them. It gives continuity without deciding the destination. Its mature fruit can therefore be described not as the person who has renounced the most, suffered the most, or maintained the strictest rule, but as someone who requires less unnecessary reinforcement in order to remain oriented, whose pleasures do not automatically become demands, whose discomfort does not automatically become emergency, whose attention can remain, whose body is disciplined without being hated, whose will can yield without losing conscience, and whose simplicity frees energy rather than consuming it. The mature ascetic is not the person who has become best at defeating life. It is the person who has become harder for compulsion to command and more available to what matters. Distortion and self-sealing. The distortion of the ascetic purificatory mode begins when purification ceases to serve freedom and becomes sacred in itself. The person originally restricts something so that it governs less. Gradually, restriction itself acquires spiritual authority. What can be denied should be denied. What can be endured should be endured. Difficulty begins functioning as proof. The mode forgets its purpose. Purification was meant to remove bondage. It begins removing life. The body as enemy. The body is the first place where this inversion becomes visible because ascetic practice legitimately asks the organism to tolerate what ordinary life often avoids: hunger, fatigue, physical simplicity, long stillness, cold, heat, and other discomforts can reveal how rapidly sensation becomes interpreted as command. But suffering easily acquires prestige. The harder the practice, the deeper it appears. The less sleep, the greater the discipline. The more pain endured, the more spiritual authority seems deserved. Eventually, suffering itself begins functioning as evidence. The question that should interrupt this escalation is simple. What exactly has been purified by destroying function? Difficulty does not prove transformation. Pain does not prove freedom. A damaged body may strengthen the spiritual identity of the one who endured rather than weakening dependence. The body, which was meant to become less tyrannical, becomes the object upon which spiritual tyranny is exercised. Austerity must justify itself by the freedom it produces, not by the suffering it demonstrates. The opposite of indulgence is not extremity, it is proportion. Suppression, scrupulosity, and psychological occupation. The second great distortion appears when a behavior disappears and is therefore assumed to have been transcended. The impulse may simply have moved inward. A person can refrain externally while becoming increasingly obsessed with the forbidden object. Food, pleasure, status, speech, possession, or sexuality may occupy more psychic space after renunciation than before. The external act has disappeared. The psychological territory has expanded. The object has been removed from life and installed at the center of consciousness. The same structure can become scrupulosity. The practitioner begins monitoring consciousness continually for contamination. Was that pleasure excessive? Was the intention pure? Did pride arise? Was that thought itself a failure? Every motivation may conceal another impurity, every pleasure another attachment, every restraint another opportunity for pride. The search has no natural end. The person becomes occupied with purification rather than purified. Purity becomes the most persistent impurity in consciousness. What was supposed to free attention now consumes it. This is why aversion cannot be mistaken for freedom. The person may have reversed the polarity while preserving the fixation. Craving and aversion can be opposite forms of the same bondage. Purity as identity and metaphysics. Ascetic practice creates visible sacrifices, and visible sacrifice easily becomes identity. The person owns little, eats differently, maintains a difficult vow, lives in a way ordinary people find demanding, and gradually becomes the pure one. This produces an unusually convincing form of spiritual superiority because the evidence is visible. The discipline has genuinely cost something. The person can point to the sacrifice. But the cost of a practice does not determine its spiritual depth. Severity of discipline is not depth of purification. A householder may own property while being less psychologically possessed by it than a monk whose identity depends upon owning nothing. A person living an ordinary embodied life may be freer from obsession than someone whose entire spiritual world revolves around monitoring purity. The deeper test is, does renunciation make the person less interested in ranking those who have not renounced? If not, another possession has appeared. The person possesses purity. A closely related distortion occurs when a practical discipline becomes a universal statement about reality. Something agitates my practice, therefore it is spiritually impure. Solitude helps me now, therefore household life is inferior. This teacher's structure protects me from confusion, therefore obedience is inherently the highest virtue. The medicine becomes metaphysics. A developmental instruction becomes ontology. The original question, what helps this consciousness become freer, turns into, what must every serious person do? This is the point where purification becomes moral domination. A mature ascetic can say, I need this discipline. The shadow ascetic says, anyone who does not need it is lower. Escalation and the appetite for austerity. Asceticism can even become another form of appetite. The person initially relinquishes ordinary pleasures, but discovers the subtler pleasure of mastery itself. The longer fast, harsher climate, stricter rule, more dramatic renunciation, more difficult discipline. Each new severity confirms identity. I conquered this too. Then another threshold is required. The original appetite for pleasure has migrated into an appetite for refusal. Once the person needed admiration, now they need admiration for not needing admiration. Once possession mattered, now possessionlessness must be possessed. Ordinary appetites are renounced, and an appetite for renunciation takes their place. The underlying movement remains familiar, more, further, again, not enough. This is Rajas wearing ascetic clothing. The ability to say enough, therefore, becomes one of the most important mature corrections of this mode. Development is not mathematically proportional to extremity. Sometimes adding more discipline is precisely the wrong medicine. When the vow exceeds the person, institutions can intensify this problem by imposing an external ascetic form before the individual's psychological structure can carry it. A vow can control behavior long before consciousness has matured into the vow. The role matures faster than the person. This can create enormous pressure. Desire does not disappear because robes changed. Need for intimacy does not disappear because monastic identity was accepted. Ambition does not vanish with possessions. Aggression does not disappear because humility becomes obligatory. A system becomes dangerous when every resulting difficulty is interpreted as proof that still more of the same discipline is needed. The practitioner struggles. The answer is more suppression. The body deteriorates. That proves attachment to the body must be overcome. The mind becomes obsessed. That proves stricter purity is necessary. The person wants to leave. That proves ego is resisting surrender. No evidence can count against the form. A rule can be sacred without being universally inhabitable. Mature asceticism must preserve differences of temperament, development, vocation, health, and circumstance. A discipline transformative for one person can be destructive for another. Obedience and the outsourcing of conscience. The institutional shadow becomes especially severe around obedience because self-will genuinely can require training. A person may confuse preference with truth, resist correction, and avoid tasks they dislike. Submitting preference to an external structure can expose this. The corruption begins when surrendering self-will becomes surrendering judgment. The teacher says, do this, then, do not question this, then, your doubt is ego. Your resistance is impurity. Your desire to leave proves you most need to stay. Every objection now confirms the authority interpreting the objection. The teacher becomes not merely guide, but arbiter of the disciple's inner reality. The result can be profound infantilization. The adult learns perfectly what the teacher would say while becoming less capable of encountering reality independently. A disturbing question remains. What has this person actually come to see? External discipline should gradually become internal discernment. The mature disciple learns, experiments, fails, recognizes evasions, and eventually becomes increasingly capable of truth without continual supervision. The pathological relationship reverses this development. The disciple needs to remain the perfect disciple. The teacher needs to remain indispensable. The immature disciple cannot leave. The immature teacher cannot let them leave. The purpose of spiritual obedience is not permanent spiritual childhood. It is to purify sovereignty of compulsive self-will, not to abolish sovereignty itself. Renunciation is avoidance, power, and invisible cost. Renunciation can also conceal avoidance. Leaving ordinary life may be courageous. It may also protect someone from work, intimacy, responsibility, social difficulty, or ordinary adulthood. The external gesture alone cannot decide. The question is, was something genuinely relinquished, or was an unwanted life merely redescribed as renunciation? True renunciation usually costs something the person was actually capable of having or pursuing. Counterfeit renunciation can sometimes transform inability into spiritual superiority. A related shadow appears when worldly status is renounced only to generate spiritual status. The person owns nothing and therefore appears incorruptible, lives simply and therefore appears incapable of manipulation, remains celibate and therefore appears beyond ordinary motives. None of these conclusions follows automatically. A person may possess no private property and still command enormous institutional power. They may renounce money while controlling organizations built from other people's donations. They may live simply and still require obedience. The absence of possessions does not imply the absence of power. Ascetic authority can become unusually difficult to scrutinize precisely because sacrifice appears morally clean. The costs of renunciation can also become invisible. The renunciate owns little, yet someone cooks, grows food, repairs buildings, pays for medicine, or maintains the institution. There is nothing inherently wrong with reciprocal relationships between ascetics and householders. Such relationships can be beautiful. The distortion lies in imagining that social dependence has disappeared merely because personal property has disappeared. Has the cost of renunciation vanished, or has it merely become invisible to the one who renounced? Mature simplicity produces gratitude rather than fantasies of total independence. When purification makes the person less alive, all these distortions eventually converge in a recognizable outcome. The person becomes extraordinarily disciplined and increasingly narrow. Pleasure produces guilt. Noise becomes threatening. Relationships endanger purity. Children feel spiritually disruptive. Unplanned events become contamination. The body is regarded with suspicion. Humor disappears. Beauty becomes dangerous. Comfort becomes moral failure. The practice has produced a smaller inhabitable world. This is the opposite of mature purification. Mature purification allows more of reality to be encountered with less grasping and less fear. Distorted purification increasingly requires reality itself to shrink so that the purified identity can survive. The mature ascetic becomes less dependent. The distorted ascetic becomes less alive. One requires less from life and can therefore meet more of it. The other requires more and more of life to remain excluded. The self-sealing ascetic. The final distortion appears when nothing is permitted to correct the practice. The person is exhausted. The discipline must be working deeply. The body is injured. Attachment to the body is being purified. Obsession increases. More restriction is needed. Doubt appears. Faith must become stronger. Someone leaves. They were unqualified. Someone criticizes the teacher. Arrogance has been exposed. Every failure becomes proof that more of the same medicine is required. This is where purification becomes self-sealing. The discipline can no longer ask whether it produces freedom, because the discipline itself has become sacred identity. A living purificatory path must retain the possibility of saying, this practice is harming rather than clarifying. This vow does not fit this person. This authority has become an obstacle. This austerity has ceased producing freedom. This restriction was medicine, and the medicine has done its work. Without this possibility, discipline becomes captivity. The final distinction is simple. More severe does not mean more free. Asceticism was never meant to make human beings increasingly skilled at violence toward themselves. Its purpose was to remove what prevented consciousness from standing freely in the presence of life. Testing it in life. The ascetic purificatory mode is unusually easy to display and unusually difficult to verify. A person may fast, own little, wake early, maintain silence, follow strict vows, or avoid entertainment. Yet none of this establishes that dependence has actually weakened. The central question is not, how much have I removed from my life? It is, how much less power does it now have over consciousness? Several tests bring this into ordinary life. What happens when the object returns? Protected environments can be legitimate and necessary. A monastery is not a failed path because it limits stimulation. A lifelong vow does not need to be broken to prove freedom. A person recovering from addiction should not re-expose themselves merely for spiritual theater. Freedom does not require unnecessary exposure. But when life itself presents what has been restricted, the practitioner's response reveals something. Does attraction produce immediate panic or contempt? Does money awaken obsessive fantasy? Does noise destroy every trace of inner steadiness? Does interruption provoke disproportionate rage? The mature question is psychological. Does the absent object remain saturated with fascination, fear, disgust, superiority, or threat? A protected environment should serve freedom rather than conceal fragility from the practitioner. Has the object become less psychologically central? This may be the most important test. The outward behavior is visible. Psychological occupation is harder to see. The person reduces food. How much time is now spent thinking about food? They relinquish possessions. How much comparison remains? They enter silence. How much inner argument continues? They leave social media. Do they become freer or merely spend the day thinking about what they are missing? Does the discipline reduce the amount of consciousness consumed by the object? If not, the outer life may have become simpler while the inner life has become more crowded. That is not yet purification. Can discipline hear reality, say enough? Firmness is necessary because desire negotiates cleverly. If every rule is reconsidered at the exact moment obedience becomes uncomfortable, little training occurs. But firmness can become stupidity when circumstances genuinely change. The person becomes ill, the body ages, sleep deprivation damages cognition. A once useful fast becomes physically destabilizing. A discipline appropriate for one stage becomes harmful in another. The mature practitioner must distinguish between the ego inventing an excuse and reality providing corrective information. Sometimes the correct ascetic word is not more, it is enough, not because appetite won, because the medicine has reached its useful dose. The body is one of the places through which reality can say enough. Mature discipline listens without turning every limit into weakness. Can pleasure and ordinary life return without guilt? Many practitioners learn to endure discomfort more easily than they learn to receive pleasure without metaphysical drama. A pleasant meal, warm room, praise, beauty, affection, or rest can threaten the identity constructed around renunciation. This reveals another form of dependence. The person is not governed directly by pleasure, but by the need to prove independence from it. Freedom from pleasure includes freedom from the need to reject pleasure. The mature ascetic can receive a pleasant condition without demanding that it continue. Pleasure becomes smaller in demand and sometimes therefore more immediate. A cup of tea can simply be a cup of tea. Rest can simply be rest. The same test applies to ordinary life more generally. Has the practice increased capacity or merely narrowed the conditions under which coherence is possible? A monastic vocation does not require becoming a householder, but maturity should not require contempt for householders, children, noise, ordinary responsibility, or the human limits of people whose lives are different. The mature ascetic becomes simpler, not narrower. Has authority become discernment? Where obedience has been part of training, can the person now stand without constant supervision? Can they make difficult judgments, recognize when an instruction no longer fits reality, remain grateful while disagreeing? The mature fruit is not rebellion, it is internalized capacity. Am I becoming more capable of truth without supervision? A healthy teacher-student relationship gradually reduces unnecessary dependence. Influence may remain enormous, gratitude may deepen, but influence need not remain jurisdiction forever. The mature disciple can say, "What I received remains real even where my judgment now differs." The mature teacher can permit that sentence to exist. What has the released energy made possible? Renunciation is not self-validating. If the person consumes less, speaks less, owns less, requires less status, and protects attention more carefully, what becomes possible because of that freedom? More contemplation, more reliable work, more prayer, more service, more patience, more availability to another human being? Or does spiritual life remain almost entirely preoccupied with maintaining the machinery of purification? The crucial question is, what is this freedom for? If less consciousness is consumed by appetite, more should become available somewhere. Otherwise, one form of self-preoccupation may simply have replaced another. This also creates a test of compassion. Severe discipline can harden the person if their own endurance becomes the standard imposed upon everyone else. The practitioner who has discovered how difficult conditioning can be should ideally become less naive about human weakness, not more contemptuous. The final test, freer or more controlled. All the tests converge here. A person can become extraordinarily controlled, meals regulated, hours scheduled, stimuli restricted, thoughts monitored, possessions counted, bodily behavior disciplined. This can look like mastery, but control and freedom are not identical. Control may require constant pressure. If the pressure relaxes, the structure rebounds. Freedom is quieter. A desire can appear without immediate obedience. A preference can be denied without rage. Pleasure can be received without grasping. Discomfort can remain without panic. A rule can be adjusted without collapse. Authority can be honored without conscience being surrendered. Failure can occur without destroying identity. The question is mercilessly simple. Has purification made me freer or merely more controlled? And one further question protects the whole mode from narrowing into sophisticated avoidance. Can I require less from life without requiring life itself to become smaller? The deepest proof of ascetic purificatory maturity is therefore not how much existence has been successfully excluded. It is how much of existence can now be encountered without losing freedom. Traditions, exemplars, and configurations. The ascetic purificatory mode is one of the most widely recognizable spiritual architectures because its archetypes occur almost everywhere. The monk, sadhu, renunciate, hermit, fasting saint, celibate contemplative, forest practitioner, or person who radically simplifies life in order to become less governed by it. Its significance cannot be reduced to a few personalities. Traditions that disagree profoundly about metaphysics repeatedly rediscover similar practical disciplines because they encounter the same human problem. The human problem of compulsion keeps being rediscovered. Different traditions explain bondage differently. They speak of karma, craving, passions, sin, attachment, ignorance, self-will, rajas, or dependence upon externals. Yet they repeatedly regulate food, possession, speech, attention, sexuality, comfort, and stimulation. The metaphysical explanations differ. The organism being trained remains recognizably human. India, tapas, brahmacharya, and sannyasa. Few civilizations have made the ascetic archetype as culturally visible as India. The sadhu, leaving household life, the sannyasin with few possessions, the brahmachari practicing restraint, the yogi engaged in tapas, and the forest renunciate all express a shared conviction. Ordinary conditioning can be deliberately worked upon. Indian traditions do not speak with one voice. Some celebrate severe austerity, others warn against excess. Some place renunciation near the normative summit of spiritual development. Others insist that liberation is equally possible within household life. The Bhagavad Gita is particularly illuminating because it does not validate austerity merely because austerity is difficult. It differentiates forms of tapas according to the consciousness governing them. Steadiness without attachment to reward, practice motivated by honor or display, and distorted self-torment. This internal discrimination is crucial. Asceticism can become purification, performance, or violence. Severity is therefore never self-validating. The question remains what kind of consciousness the discipline produces. Jainism, asceticism as a complete spiritual ecology. Jainism may represent one of the most radical civilization scale embodiments of ascetic purificatory consciousness. Restraint extends through non-violence, truthfulness, non-possession, food, movement, sexuality, speech, sensory life, meditation, and vigilance toward the effects of action upon living beings. The distinction between household vows and the far stricter vows of ascetics makes the developmental logic explicit. Monastic life intensifies restraints that lay followers observe more partially. Jain traditions also distinguish external austerities from internal disciplines such as repentance, humility, study, service, meditation, and loosening identification with the body. This matters because Jain asceticism cannot be reduced to spectacular endurance. The external operation serves an internal aim. Everything becomes subject to the question, what perpetuates bondage and how can its conditions be reduced? Its greatness lies in extraordinary consistency. Its danger is the same consistency pushed beyond proportion. When less bodily and worldly involvement increasingly appears inherently purer, severity can acquire spiritual authority simply because it is severe. Jainism therefore reveals both the power and the inherent risk of the mode at unusual intensity. Buddhism, discipline corrected by the middle way. Buddhism offers one of the clearest examples of ascetic purificatory consciousness correcting its own attraction to extremity. Buddhist monastic life remains deeply disciplined. Celibacy, restricted possessions, attention to food, sense restraint, seclusion, mindfulness, contentment with simple necessities, and carefully regulated conduct. Yet the foundational narrative refuses to equate awakening with maximal mortification. The Buddha's rejection of both sensual indulgence and self-affliction establishes one of the great internal corrections of ascetic spirituality. The conclusion is not that discipline is unnecessary. The monastic path clearly says otherwise. The conclusion is purification is not proportional to suffering. The body can be disciplined without being hated. Craving can be renounced without developing an appetite for self-torture. Simplicity can become radical without deprivation becoming sacred in itself. The middle way, therefore, protects ascetic purificatory practice from its own tendency to mistake severity for depth. Christianity, desert, monastery, and the discipline of will. Christianity produced an equally powerful ascetic imagination through the desert fathers and mothers, hermits, anchorites, monasteries, fasting, chastity, poverty, vigils, silence, manual labor, and obedience. The desert became more than geography. It became a laboratory in which the passions could no longer hide as easily behind social recognition, abundance, and constant stimulation. Anthony the Great became one of the archetypal figures of this current, not merely because of deprivation, but because withdrawal was understood as a confrontation with the forces ordinarily concealed by worldly life. Importantly, the mature image is not simply a person who disappears forever. The renunciate can return carrying another relation to fear, possession, recognition, and desire. Christian monasticism also makes obedience unusually visible as purification of preference. The monk discovers that what is wanted is not necessarily what must happen. This can be a powerful training of self-will. Its shadow is equally obvious. Temporary discipline can harden into permanent abandonment of judgment. Mature obedience therefore cannot culminate in spiritual childhood. Its fruit should be a will less compelled to place itself at the center while remaining responsible before truth. Baba Lokanath Brahmachari, renunciation without hatred. Baba Lokanath offers a useful image of mature asceticism because severe brahmacarya need not require sexuality or embodied life to become metaphysically evil. The deeper purificatory question is not whether desire can be condemned, but whether its compulsory sovereignty can weaken and its energy become reorganized. This gives the example an important developmental lesson. Transcendence is not repression. Renouncing one expression of desire does not require hatred of desire's existence. Hostility may bind consciousness to the object almost as strongly as craving. The mature movement allows desire to lose its jurisdiction without requiring creation itself to be treated as spiritual error. Ramana Maharshi, Ascetic Fruit, from a Subtractive Axial Center. Ramana Maharshi belongs in this chapter only with a clear qualification. His governing spiritual operation was not ascetic purificatory. It was subtractive axial, inquiry into the source of the I, refusal to grant final reality to passing identifications, and return toward the ground of the apparent subject. His simplicity was therefore not primarily the product of an ascetic program through which appetite was progressively conquered. The direction of causality was largely the reverse. As identification weakened, many ordinary demands appeared to have lost psychological importance. The external life could look radically ascetic: few possessions, indifference to status, celibacy, simple conditions, little conventional acquisition, without austerity itself becoming the central drama. This makes Ramana valuable here precisely as a secondary exemplar of mature ascetic fruit produced by another mode. He illustrates renunciation by non-need. The primary ascetic says, I will train what has power over me until its power weakens. The mature subtractive fruit may simply contain less movement toward possession because the claimant of possession no longer occupies the same center. Ramana therefore should not be classified as primarily ascetic, merely because his life looked renounced. His path demonstrates why outward similarity cannot identify the governing mode. The highest fruit of asceticism may resemble the byproduct of another realization. The struggle disappears because the need itself has become quiet. This is exactly why primary and secondary configurations must remain distinct. Stoicism, a philosophical cousin. Stoicism is not reducible to ascetic purificatory consciousness because it contains strong analytical and ethical dimensions, yet its discipline toward externals makes it one of the clearest philosophical cousins of this mode. Possession, reputation, bodily comfort, social position, and external success cannot be controlled completely. What remains closer to the person's jurisdiction is the use made of impressions and responses. This produces a recognizable ascetic training. Discomfort can occur without becoming catastrophe. External events can refuse preference, and attention can return toward the quality of response. Modern Stoic culture has revived voluntary discomfort, restricted consumption, deliberate simplicity, and resistance to consumer dependence. At its best, this responds intelligently to a culture of continuous stimulation. At its worst, the same techniques construct the invulnerable achiever harder, more productive, less emotionally accessible, better able to work without rest. This may simply be rajas disciplining itself into more efficient rajas. Again, the central question returns: what is the discipline serving? Primary and secondary configurations. This distinction is especially important for ascetic purificatory consciousness because almost every serious path borrows some of its capacities. A devotee may fast and live simply because love has reorganized desire. The primary mode remains devotional relational. A ritualist may regulate food, sleep, sexuality, and behavior because sacred form requires continuity. The primary mode remains ritual sacramental. A subtractive contemplative may withdraw because solitude facilitates inquiry. The primary operation remains subtractive. A transgressive practitioner may undergo years of restraint because containment is required before a boundary can be crossed safely. The ascetic structure is real, but it serves another operation. The question is purification itself the governing spiritual operation, or is purification making another operation possible? This is why ascetic purificatory consciousness has such an unusual position among the modes. It can become an entire spiritual path, but it can also become a structural capacity within almost any other path. Devotion borrows fidelity, ritual borrows endurance, visionary practice borrows protection from overstimulation, subtractive inquiry borrows the capacity to remain before discomfort, compassion borrows willingness to bear inconvenience, analysis borrows patience, architecture borrows tenacity, transgression borrows containment. The mode functions like a spine, like asceticism and transgression. The relation to the transgressive transformative mode deserves special emphasis because it reveals the edge of asceticism itself. The ascetic builds the boundary, the transgressor crosses it. Yet a boundary cannot be meaningfully transcended if it could never be maintained. A person unable to abstain has demonstrated very little by indulging. A person unable to contain intensity has not proved freedom by entering more intensity. Asceticism therefore creates enough freedom from appetite that entering appetite no longer necessarily means obedience to appetite. Its question is, can you refrain? The transgressive mode will ask, can you enter without becoming enslaved? Each exposes the other's counterfeit. The pattern across traditions. Across Jainism, Buddhism, Christianity, Hindu renunciatory traditions, and philosophical cousins such as Stoicism, metaphysical worlds remain radically different, yet something keeps recurring. The body is trained, the senses are guarded, desire is observed, comfort is made less absolute, possession is reduced, attention is protected. The person learns to remain in the interval between wanting and receiving. This does not prove that all traditions secretly teach the same metaphysics. It reveals something more modest. Traditions that disagree profoundly about ultimate reality repeatedly discover that an untrained organism does not become spiritually free merely because it has acquired a sublime doctrine. A person can understand emptiness and remain terrified of discomfort, affirm non-duality and remain dependent upon praise, perform elaborate sacred ritual while being governed by impulse, possess sophisticated philosophy while being unable to remain with boredom for 5 minutes. Ascetic purificatory consciousness addresses this gap. The truth must eventually become stronger than the habit. The mode does not determine what the person ultimately lives for. It helps determine whether they can remain faithful to it when another part of them wants something easier. Return to proportion. The ascetic purificatory mode is easiest to recognize through extreme images: cave, monastery, begging bowl, fasting body, celibate vow, hermit's cell. Yet most people will never live in these forms, while almost everyone encounters the problem toward which they point. How much of my life is actually governed by appetite, distraction, comfort, fear, and preference? The phone that cannot remain unchecked, the irritation that must be expressed, the pleasure that must be repeated, the opinion that must be defended, the schedule that must never be interrupted. These are small sovereignties. Ascetic purificatory consciousness asks whether they can become lighter. Its mature return to proportion begins when the boundary is remembered as medicine rather than final metaphysics. A restriction may initially need to be strong because habit is strong. The door closes, the stimulus is removed. The vow is held firmly enough that desire cannot renegotiate it every morning, but the discipline should eventually reveal whether anything deeper has changed. A mature discipline should produce more freedom than the discipline itself contains. The point is not to remain forever dependent upon the wall that protected the early practice. Some walls may remain for life because nothing would be gained from removing them. But psychologically, the practitioner should understand what the wall serves. The discipline becomes integrated rather than panicked. This is why severity cannot measure maturity. A dramatic fast can be seen, freedom from obsession with food cannot. Possessionlessness is visible, freedom from status is not. A strict vow is visible, the quiet absence of inner bargaining is not. The more successful asceticism becomes, the less asceticism may need to dominate consciousness. At first, food must be watched. Later, food may simply matter less. At first, silence is imposed. Later, silence is natural. At first, stimulation is restricted. Later, sustained attention requires less protection. At first, discipline feels like force. Later, less force is needed. The mode, therefore, cannot mature through permanent opposition. If every pleasure must still be fought, every attraction feared, every comfort distrusted, and every interruption treated as contamination, consciousness remains organized around precisely what it claims to have surpassed. The mature ascetic becomes simpler, not narrower. Narrowness reduces life because life remains threatening. Simplicity reduces unnecessary demand so that life can be encountered more directly. The difference can look almost invisible from outside. Both people may live quietly, own little, maintain boundaries, and refuse certain pleasures. Inwardly, one is protecting a fragile structure, the other is caring less. From control to freedom. The shadow ascetic becomes increasingly controlled. The mature ascetic becomes increasingly free. Both may keep routines and maintain vows, yet control requires constant management. The object must remain excluded because its appearance threatens collapse. Freedom increasingly requires less defensive effort. A lifelong vow may remain lifelong. Mature freedom does not need to expose itself unnecessarily in order to prove something, but the rule is no longer held in panic. The body also returns to proportion. It is neither master nor enemy. It is conditioned, vulnerable, finite, sometimes wise, sometimes deceptive, sometimes simply tired. The practitioner learns to distinguish real need from habit, habit from compulsion, compulsion from preference, and preference from truth. This discrimination is one of the quiet fruits of the entire path. The return of pleasure. A particularly revealing maturation occurs when pleasure can return without becoming either sovereign or guilty. The person who no longer requires constant stimulation may experience a walk, sunlight, music, conversation, food, or rest with unusual vividness because pleasure no longer has to become salvation. It can remain small, complete, temporary. Freedom from pleasure is not incapacity for pleasure. It is freedom from demanding that pleasure become more than it is. The same applies to possession and relationship. Something beautiful can be used without identity being constructed from it. Love can be received without another person becoming responsible for filling every lack. Comfort can be accepted without the demand that life remain comfortable. The object may be the same, the relationship is not. What asceticism cannot do. The mode also returns to proportion when it recognizes that not everything is solved by discipline. Love cannot be manufactured through restraint. Vision cannot be forced through endurance. Meaning cannot be created merely through refusal. Compassion may require allowing another person's need to interrupt one's schedule. Relationship exposes vulnerabilities solitude cannot reproduce. Analysis sometimes reveals that a treasured discipline no longer serves its original purpose. Transgression may expose what purification has merely kept outside the gates. Asceticism's great gift is structural integrity. It trains continuity, attention, patience, restraint, and the capacity to remain when immediate reward disappears. But a spine does not tell the organism where to walk. Asceticism gives strength to a direction. It does not determine what the direction should be. An extraordinarily disciplined person may still be cruel, deluded, closed, vain, or obedient to destructive authority. Discipline amplifies what it serves. The mature ascetic must therefore eventually ask, not only, can I remain, but what am I remaining faithful to? From renunciation to availability. The deepest fruit of ascetic purificatory consciousness is therefore not deprivation. It is availability. Because less of the person is consumed by appetite, more becomes available for love. Because less energy is spent maintaining image, more becomes available for truth. Because attention is less fragmented, more becomes available for contemplation. Because comfort is less absolute, more becomes available for difficult service. Because self-will is less compulsory, more becomes available for reality. This does not make the ascetic automatically loving, wise, analytical, compassionate, or contemplative. Those are other operations, but it creates room in which those operations can become embodied. The spiritual insight must have somewhere to live. Love requires continuity. Prayer requires attention. Ethical responsibility requires the ability to refuse impulse. Freedom requires more than possession of the correct idea about freedom. The organism must become capable of carrying what consciousness has seen. Ascetic purificatory practice works on that carrying capacity. Its questions are less glamorous. Can you remain? Can you wait? Can you refuse? Can you continue when nothing rewards you? Can you stop feeding what you claim you want to transcend? These are not the whole spiritual path, but without them, sublime insights can remain strangely powerless before ordinary habit. At the boundary. And yet, asceticism eventually reaches its own edge. The boundary has been built, the appetite restrained. The person has learned, I do not have to cross. Then another question appears. What if the boundary itself has become absolute? What if what lies beyond it remains frightening because it has never been integrated? What if purity still depends upon exclusion? What if the practitioner is free only while the object remains outside the sacred world? Ascetic purificatory consciousness reaches a limit precisely through its greatest achievement, containment. Its achievement is real. Its possible final prison is the same containment. The mode teaches an indispensable truth. You are freer than your desire. The next mode asks whether freedom survives another test. Are you also freer than your fear of desire? This does not invalidate asceticism, it presupposes it. A boundary can be crossed meaningfully only where there is some capacity to keep it. Without the ability to renounce, transgression easily becomes permission. Without containment, intensity becomes compulsion. But the polarity also runs the other way. If the ascetic can never encounter what was renounced without fear, hatred, disgust, or collapse, purification remains incomplete in another sense. The two modes therefore stand facing one another. Asceticism asks, could you abstain? Transgression asks, could you enter? Asceticism warns, do not call appetite freedom. Transgression will warn, do not call fear purity. Between them lies one of the deepest paradoxes of spiritual maturation. The boundary may be necessary, it may train, protect, and save. Yet the boundary itself must not become another condition without which consciousness is incapable of remaining whole. The mature ascetic, therefore, does not end by worshipping renunciation. Renunciation has done its work when the person becomes less dependent, less frightened, less scattered, less governed by appetite, and more capable of meeting reality as it comes. The final measure is not how much life has been refused, it is how much life can now be encountered without servitude. The mode begins with restraint, it matures through purification, it flowers in sufficiency, and at its highest point, it becomes something quieter than austerity, the capacity to stand in the world without demanding that the world continually satisfy, protect, stimulate, or obey you. From there, another gate appears.